Hello and welcome to 21st Century Vitalism. This is a podcast exploring how we can best maintain a sense of energy, inspiration, and wakefulness while living with the unique and challenging stressors of the modern age. My name is Brett Kane, and I'll be your host on this journey as we talk with a wide variety of people from a multitude of backgrounds who each hold a piece to the puzzle that is being fully alive in this uncertain time. This typically includes spiritual teachers, somatic therapists, artists, environmentalists, activists, or really anyone else that I feel bears this torch well. On that note, today's episode is really special in that we're going to be sitting down with one of the West's most prominent and influential meditation teachers, Sharon Salzberg. With over 50 years of teaching mindfulness-based practices, Sharon is largely attributed as being one of the first teachers to bring these traditions over to the West. Not only that, but she's also gone on to write 13 books, co-found the Insight Meditation Society, and hosts the widely popular Meta Hour podcast. In this conversation, we talk about the journey she outlines in one of her newest books, Real Life, in which she details the process of moving from a constricted frame of mind to one that is more expansive and clear. To do this, we explore the role of mindfulness in meeting the challenges of life head on, and the importance of cultivating a quality of loving kindness within ourselves. There's a lot to offer here, so let's get to it. Before that, though, if you want to start studying with Sharon, head on over to sharonsalzberg.com to check out her online offerings. Beyond that, I highly recommend buying some of her books wherever you get your books. I have quite a few of them myself and have found them to be tremendously insightful. She also has a podcast called Meta Hour, which you can stream wherever you plug into your podcasts. So, if you want to support this show, consider heading on over to patreon.com/21stcenturyvitalism to consider signing up and helping me keep the lights on. If finances are tight, totally okay. You can also subscribe on YouTube, like us on Facebook, or follow us on Instagram. Really, any and all interaction helps, and I see you and I appreciate you immensely. So, without further ado, please sit back, drink some tea, maybe do some stretches, but most importantly, open your heart for Sharon Salzberg. Okay, yeah. So, Sharon, hello. We are now live. As I always start the show, I just want to start again by saying thank you so much for giving me some of your time. We've been working on this collaboration for a little bit now, so it's really great to have you in front of me. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, great. So I was just telling you before we started recording, but I had just finished one of your newer books, Real Life, and congratulations on getting to write something like this. I feel like it's a very timely piece, and it really feels like a complete distillation of the spiritual path. You found a way to really encapsulate so many elements of what we're doing when we commit to a practice. And I really appreciated, as I was saying, the way you frame it out as a journey from constriction to expansion. I think that that's something we each kind of have our own unique sense of. I think when most people hear that, they have experiences that they've gone through or they can associate those phrases. But because of that, I do want to just hear your interpretation of it so we kind of have like a shared definition of what we're talking about.
Mhm.
So, yeah, what do you mean by constriction and expansion?
Well, sometimes in trying to describe constriction, I also try to distinguish it from being like intentional and one pointed and purposeful and things like that. I really mean more a sense of being trapped. When we feel completely overwhelmed by something, an emotional state or some situation, or defined by it, so that we don't have a sense of options. We don't have a sense of space or possibility. And it happens to us many times a day, a different mind state, grasping or fear or something arises. And it's not just a thing that we feel, oh, I'm aware of this and my awareness is bigger than this state. It's like this state, it becomes everything. And we feel also very disconnected because it's a very isolating sense. And in contrast to that, there's expansion when we can breathe free. We feel, oh, there are options. I don't know what's going to happen. It's not that kind of sense, but many things might happen. And so uh, I also use this model that a friend of mine named Barbara Fredrickson, who's a researcher into positive state. She's a positive psychologist, and she had a framework which they call the Fredrickson model of broaden and build. And what she's saying is that if you have certain states that you strengthen, that you work on, like love, uh, equanimity, gratitude, generosity, that it does two things. It broadens your perspective. It opens up your world. You just have such a bigger sense of things. And I really saw that in myself because I know the opposite too, when I feel really overriding fear, everything shrinks and it's
Yeah.
all tight. And then the other part of her model is the build part, that when we strengthen these states, we build a sense of inner resource so that if we're facing trouble, adversity, or some kind of difficulty, we don't feel like I've got nothing going inside to meet this moment, And so it's broaden and build. And I often refer back to that model.
Yeah, that's wonderful. You addressed a part of it that I think is really important in that when we are in a space of constriction, there's no space. It can feel very claustrophobic, and it's really hard to see the constriction itself, let alone any of these pro-positive things. So I always find it to be really useful to, I feel like there's like an antidote just in describing a sickness, and really understanding something. And I think you do really great in the book by your exploration of the three poisons, as they're commonly called. Specifically with delusion, you had a quote in there I'll get to later that I was like, oh, I understand it in a way I haven't before. But for the people who are very new to this, who are feel far away from these positive qualities, how would you go a little bit deeper into the nature of the constriction, and how do the three poisons kind of manifest and kind of make us feel that claustrophobia?
Well, in terms of mindfulness, what we try to do when one of those states arises, and grasping and aversion, which are anger or fear, are a little easier to see than delusion, which can be more like confusion and being spaced out and numb and things like that. But when any of them arise, usually, uh, let's take anger, as one example. We get interested, really, sometimes obsessively interested in the situation, the object, what we're going to do about it, that person, what they said, or whatever. And we so rarely pivot our attention as though to ask ourselves, what does anger feel like? What's it made of? And that's what we do in mindfulness meditation or mindfulness practice, is we make that pivot and we first look perhaps like, what does it feel like in my body? And then we might watch in effect the anger movie and we might see a lot of feelings inside the anger. We might see fear, we might see sadness. Almost inevitably, I think with very strong anger, we'll find a sense of helplessness in there somewhere. And then if we decide to take action, we can do it from a more comprehensive understanding of all those feelings. Um, and we also see that it's constantly changing. It feels so solid, so forever, so permanent, unyielding. But if we really look at it, it's moving. It's an alive system.
Yeah.
And that's insight. That's what we call insight. So that's what we're going for in the meditation. It gives us so much understanding of what we feel and its nature, and even just realizing what it feels like in our body. Because then when we're at work or we're at school or we're commuting and that very thing is coming up, the body is the first avenue of recognizing what's going on, often long before the cognitive thought arises, like, they're really annoying, aren't they? We like feel it coming up, and then we can choose to act or not. We're empowered.
Yeah.
to make that choice.
Yeah, there's something really challenging about this process. It's funny that most people who typically don't meditate view meditation as this very peaceful thing where they, on the cover of like a yoga journal, they're sitting with their mudras and smiling. And from my experience, though, and I don't have the super loud emotions, I probably tend more toward um, being more spaced out than anything. But I do know from the times that I have choosing to sit, it's a challenge when you feel like you're internally on fire. So how would you have any recommendations for people who are experiencing either really strong grasping when they just really want something, or if they're really revolted by something? How do you ease into that through practice?
Well, a lot of it does depend on expectation and understanding, because you're right. Of course, people think, I mean, I think if I were in some social situation, more recently and introduced to somebody as a meditation teacher, I commonly would hear, I tried that once, I failed at it. Because the expectation is I should be peaceful. I should have a totally blank mind. I shouldn't get anxious anymore, and it's not necessarily like that. It's not unremittingly painful either.
Yeah.
There's certainly, it's always changing, and there are glorious, beautiful, wondrous times, and there are very, very difficult times because it's everything. It's like life.
Yeah.
And to understand that's not wrong. You haven't failed. You haven't, flunked the course. You're not weird. That this is natural is very important. Like, I'm somewhat famous. I started my practice in January of 1971 with S.N. Goenka in India in a 10-day intensive retreat. And I'm somewhat famous amongst my friends who I met, several friends right there. I've known all these years, for once having marched up to Goenka and looking him in the eye and saying, I never used to be an angry person before I started meditating, thereby laying blame exactly where I felt it belonged, which was clearly was his fault, that I was so angry. But more clearly, I had been hugely angry and I hadn't really been in touch with it. And so this was the first really powerful introspection I'd ever done. And there it was, And so to know that that's okay and to remind yourself that that's okay, or be in a situation where someone can remind you that's normal. The question isn't what is coming up, the question is how you're relating to it.
Yeah.
That's what mindfulness is. It's a relational quality. It's not just noticing there's anger, because you could notice there's anger with like complete loathing, for yourself, but it's noticing it with some balance, some interest. And that's
Yeah.
how the insight can develop. So uh it's, and especially as mindfulness practice gets more and more popular, I think it's an important understanding, that we don't want to see lost anywhere.
Yeah. So that sounds all and well for kind of like the louder expressions of emotion. And this is when I want to read your quote, because I mean, the one that really, pertains to my personal experience that I have the most connection to is like delusion, which is kind of a heavy word now that I say it. But, you say in your book that delusion is a state of not realizing what we know and what we don't know while not actually asking the right questions. It is a state of failure or resistance to see things as they truly are. That really hit me. So how is it that we're able to break through that fog of delusion? That's the one that for me I'm still really working with, because it's so thick sometimes.
Yeah, well, in the Buddhist psychology, they have, in the Theravada version, Southern Buddhism, they have three personality types that they talk about, and they have their regular old unpurified form, and then they have a purified form, because the idea is that within each one of them is a kind of jewel, that
Mm,
if you can capture the jewel without getting caught in the rest of the turmoil, it becomes the purified form. So these three types are grasping, aversion, or anger, and delusion. And I am totally a deluded type, So it's not actually, the words sound nasty, but it's not really meant to be pejorative. It doesn't mean you're delusional, It also doesn't mean you're stupid, but deluded in this context means foggy, spaced out, and actually the other types don't sound exactly like what, we might think they do. Like they don't really mean to say you're a greedy or a grasping type doesn't mean you're a greedy person. It's more likened to the kind of person who'll walk into a room and notice everything that they like, everything that's good, everything that's beautiful. And they don't quite notice that there's a, hole in the carpet. And it's like they don't want to go there, they want to see what's beautiful. So it's limited. You don't want to just only have that response, but it's not like being a greedy person. And
Mm.
the angry type is the opposite. It's the kind of person who walk into the room and notice that hole in the carpet right away. And they won't notice the glorious painting on the wall, and in a way we count on those people because they often name what's wrong in a
Yeah.
group and no one else wants to look at that hole in the carpet.
Yeah.
We're looking the other way very determinedly, but they're saying, look at that, But of course, if you don't want to be like stuck there because
Hmm.
then you're stuck there, and
Yeah.
you don't get to take in the beautiful picture on the wall. And the deluded type is just spaced out. They don't kind of notice much until someone points it out. And that's totally me,
Yeah. Yeah.
and the purified form of the grasping is said to be, they call it faith. It doesn't mean faith in the way we use the word. It means like a love of life because you're open to things. You're willing to meet life, but you don't have that limitation. And the angry type is transformed to like penetrating intelligence because you can cut through a lot. And the deluded type is transformed to a kind of equanimity or balance, but it's not balance born of being spaced out because you just don't care. You don't notice enough to care, but you
Yeah.
do notice, and still you have that kind of balance. And so the way to make that journey for each of these is mindfulness. That's what
Mm.
will happen.
Yeah. Yeah. This brings me to another thing that I am kind of grappling with in my practice. So I'm trying to not make this like, oh, hey, I have a teacher here. I'm just going to ask her all the things that I'm working
Good.
on.
Why not?
But yeah, um, the balance between like exertion and grasping is one that always seems so paradoxical to me because it's like we have aspirations where we want to do these practices so that we can maybe be more expansive. But then the sound of like, oh, yeah, being expansive sounds really nice. And there is maybe a little bit of a quality of like, I want that niceness because there's something to it that's really syrupy that I want.
Hmm. Hmm.
So how do we balance this sense of seeking these more purified energies without getting too attached to them? How do you have the
Yeah.
exertion? How do
Yeah.
you even work toward it without building up that fire of like, I got to get something for this?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think in a few ways. One is understanding, a little bit like what I referenced before, is that mindfulness is about how we relate to what's going on. So you could be looking at the nastiest sort of thought and feeling and vengefulness, and everything that if you were lost in it would be very constricting, very
Mm,
entrapping. But if you're aware of it with some balance, that balance itself is expansive. And we can feel the freedom of that even with that wretched thing going on, whatever it is. And that's hard to believe. It's hard to practice that way, but that is really the essence of what we're doing. And so most of our judgment and our expectation and our despair comes about what's coming up, not about how we're relating to what's coming up. And we forget, that that's the point, actually. So when you catch yourself judging in that way, it's not bad to remind yourself or be in some inspirational setting where you'll be reminded, like, it's okay. It's not the object that's the point, the object of
mm,
awareness. It's the awareness that's the point.
yeah.
And so that's a very important lesson that we can all learn again and again and again.
Yeah.
Um, and then there is such a thing as right effort, and you can start to feel when it's too much, when um, you're not actually doing the practice of trying to be in the moment with what is because you're kind of reaching out. And I remember even in a subtle way myself doing it because I had this idea that I needed to have more depth in my experience. And it was sort of like punching at what was going on so I could get in there, and get deeper. And then I realized that the subjective experience of depth would come from a greater continuity of mindfulness, even if what I was mindful of was something that might feel superficial.
Yeah.
So instead of trying to trade in my experience for something better, deeper, I realized I had to more continuously be with what actually was. And that would give me the feeling of depth that I actually wanted.
Wow, that's amazing. It seems so counterintuitive to so many of the ways that I think people approach spirituality or self help. Because, I mean, we really, I think, many people, myself included, when I was especially a lot younger, thought that these were pathways toward just like something different than what was now. And really learning how to see things just more clearly provided that sense of space that, and I think when you touch that quality of space that holds everything within your experience, that's where I think all of these qualities exist. But it's not something you can own or hold on to. It's something that just
Yeah.
is there indefinitely.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was hard for me. It took me a long time to contact that space because there was so much of that bubbling up of wanting something to be different.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's a lot about meditation practice or this sort of approach that is counterintuitive. Well, it means it's going against our conditioning. And so that's why I like to think of it as an experiment. And you kind of say, what's it like, to not berate myself endlessly is one example, and kind of give myself a break and move on and begin again or something like that. Like, what's it like?
Yeah. So, one of the big things about this show is taking teachings like this and applying them to the modern age, and like really taking a look at some of the systemic issues that we're facing and the interlocking crises that we're about to be facing in the next coming decades. So, something that I also think a lot about is like how to apply these things. And I'm wondering how, like, the mindfulness approach, allowing things to be mingles with addressing things like climate change or political corruption. Is it enough to just create space and observe, or how do these infuse our actions to maybe help?
Well, to some extent, I'd go back to Barbara Fredrickson's model of broaden and build, because we are building resources which allow us to face adversity and challenge in a different way, out of that mindfulness or that mindful space. It's not like vacuous space, it leaves us seeing options where maybe we didn't see them before because we're not so trapped in our fear, for example. And I also I think of the stress dynamic, which is really a dynamic. There's the pressure, the crisis, the incident, the situation, and then there's the resource with which it's met,
Hmm.
which could be inner resource. It could be a sense of not being so alone, having a sense of community. And we know it even in a simple way in everyday life. Like maybe you didn't sleep at all last night, and then you go to work, you go to school, and you overhear a comment, and it's so grating, and you take it to heart, and you're so upset. Compared to you had a beautiful night's sleep, and you had breakfast with these loving friends or family, and you go off to your meeting, and you overhear that comment, and you think, "Boy, that person's having a bad day." It's just different. And sometimes people hear this kind of thing and they think, well, that means you're not going to ever try to do anything about the situation or the problem or the crisis, which is not true. But I always say, why try to make for change from maximum depletion and
Right.
exhaustion and overwhelm? It just doesn't help.
Yeah.
So that sense of resource will give us greater clarity. It'll give us more options. It'll give us a base of acting that's not so fearful or kind of immediately reactive, that was not bad, as a basis. I know it doesn't make total obvious sense unless you've made the experiment and you understand, oh, it doesn't leave you kind of in a fog or, totally passive. It really doesn't.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the energies that I recognize a lot within my generation as a millennial and Gen Z, just from social media, this is a generalization, but this kind of sense of hopelessness, and I know this is something you've talked about before, but as we are looking at all of these interlocking crises, it can be really easy to fall into despair in a sense of like, there's nothing we can possibly do when we look at all of the recent reports, especially climate change is one that rents my brain and heart very often. So how does this approach help us kind of deal with that sense of hopelessness, and how do we turn that into something workable for us on an individual level?
Well, for me, like when I was talking about sitting and looking at anger, when I get to the place where I can see the kind of helplessness in there, that's when I resolve to take some action, even if it seems very small. And I know when we're looking on the grand scheme of things, it seems too small, whatever it is, but nothing is too small for the person or forest or animal or, that is actually impacted. And so I try to move from like a big view to an immediate view and put something into action. Like I was talking to a friend just last night who I hadn't talked to in a long time, who lives in California and was working in a free clinic for homeless people. And she said something like, I know it is not going to solve the problem of homelessness in this town, but it's so gratifying to do something. And the people are strongly impacted, they're strongly affected. And so, we tend to belittle those efforts on our own. And we think that's not enough. It's not going to solve this grave, grave problem. And it's not, but it's something and it's real, instead of the kind of despair that is so easy to get into. And I think those times are very important. It also brings us into a community of people who are trying to make a difference. And together, then we can look large,
Hmm.
and see what other actions might be important. Like I've long talked about uh, many students through the years who'd come up to me and say, uh, I was walking down the street and somebody came up to me and asked me for $1, and I gave him $1 because that's always my habit. But this is the first time I ever looked that person in the eye and realized that was a human being. And sometimes that's where it stays, but also with that sense of community, perhaps you could start questioning, what's the housing policy in this city? What are the systemic issues that are really leading to this, and see what you might be able to do on that larger level.
Yeah. It kind of reminds me of that famous Ram Dass story. He'd always talk about, I think it was one of his friends who would kind of have that kind of engagement with somebody who was asking for money, and they'd never be able to look at them because they knew that if they did, they'd end up inviting them to stay with them. And it's like, where does the line get drawn at a
Yeah,
certain
yeah,
point? That's a pretty interesting thing to think about, the nature of boundary and the nature of like putting throttles on the heart. It's like, how do you know when enough is enough, and when you're trying to work with that, not letting yourself kind of become like a doormat. And yeah, I don't know if there's something there, like how do you engage with this opening up of the heart and still maintain your sense of boundary and barrier?
yeah. Well, I think balance is really the name of the game, and that's not easy, but it's essential. And we come to balance in a lot of different ways. One is sometimes it's a balance between compassion for someone else and compassion for ourselves. And I know a lot of caregivers, I know a lot of activists, for whom that's a hard lesson. It
Yeah.
feels selfish, it feels wrong, but it's not selfish or wrong because you have to think about, how do I sustain an effort?
Yeah.
How do I not burn out in this cause or this effort? People burn out a lot, really a lot. And it's a crisis in all and of itself.
Hmm.
And so bringing genuine compassion for oneself and some sense of realistic limits, is not a bad thing. It's also a balance between that compassion and wanting to be of help and realizing I can't fix this. No one as of yet has put me in control of the universe. And I once said in front of this group of people, if I were in charge of the universe, it would be a lot better world. And someone in the group protested. They said, "Are you sure?" And I said, "I am really sure. But guess what? It ain't going to happen." And so it doesn't mean you don't try and you don't do what you can, but it doesn't have to be with that strange savior mentality and then feeling like a failure.
Yeah.
So there's a balance there as well. And we learn that we can, and hopefully more and more, would have a heart full of loving kindness and compassion. But that does not determine the action we're going to take. People often say to me, "Well, I don't know about developing a more loving heart because then I have to give them more money or let them move back in or only say yes or only smile meekly." And it's just not true.
Yeah.
You might genuinely have all this compassion and be kind of fierce, and say no and have a boundary because you're bringing real discernment into play.
Yeah. Yeah, that brings me to something I think about often, especially when I'm reading your work. I've studied Buddhism for maybe about 4 years now, pretty intensely. And one of the things that doesn't come up as much as in other traditions is the notion of love. Like it does, and they feel like they kind of point to it with like other words and different things. But what I've recognized, like that loving awareness, especially that metta cultivates, is that it's very different than what we ascribe here in the West as love. So, could you maybe explain some of how that manifests in the Buddhist system and maybe how it might not be what people are thinking of?
Sure. Well, usually we talk about it as loving kindness, and which is a translation of a word from Pali, the language of the original Buddhist text, metta, metta. Sanskrit, it's Maitri. Um, so the conventional translation is loving kindness. I have had scholars and translators say to me, "Stop being so cutesy. Why don't you just say love? You mean love." But love is a complicated term. Sometimes we say love and it really is a medium of exchange. Like, I will love you as long as you love me in return, as long as the following 15 conditions are met. I will love myself as long as I never make a mistake. So that's certainly not what we mean by metta. Um, Often we hear the word love and we think about it like this little box, it's like romantic, it's about a certain kind of relationship. In fact, I have an earlier book called Real Love, and when it was in manuscript form, and even before that, when I had the proposal that was going out to publishers, one of the publishers said to me, "Oh, the love market is saturated," by which she meant the relationship market is saturated, like how to get a relationship, how to keep a relationship, how to end a relationship. But we mean much more a sense, even like not even an emotional sense, a bone deep acknowledgement of connection, how our lives are connected to one another. That's just the reality of the universe. How we can have a deeper connection to ourselves, all aspects of ourselves. Um, and so we say love and kindness, you know, to try to differentiate it somewhat from that more romanticized, in fact, kind of limited sense of love.
Yeah. Yeah. My current kind of understanding of it, it kind of feels like love is awareness or awareness is love. Like
Mm-hmm.
when I'm not so preoccupied on my own internal stories, and I'm able to just be fully present with somebody. It doesn't look like anything. It's not necessarily this like exuding warmth, but it's just being present with somebody,
Hmm.
sharing a space. To me feels like one of the most loving exchanges you could have, because you're actually the choice to put yourself aside, not aside, but to have space around yourself, to invite somebody into your awareness and your senses. That to me feels like maybe the love that you're alluding to.
Yeah, I think that's right. And there's this beautiful quotation from the Buddha where he said something like, develop a mind so filled with love it resembles space,
Mm,
which cannot be painted, cannot be marred, cannot be ruined. Develop a mind so filled with love it resembles space, which cannot be painted, cannot be marred, cannot be ruined. So if someone were standing here throwing paint around in the air, there's nowhere in the space for the paint to land. It's like that open, that free, that unconstrained, unconfined. So it's different from that warm feeling. I mean, that warm feeling can be great, but it is what it is, you know? It's kind of bigger than that. And
yeah.
so sometimes, like when I teach love and kindness meditation, it's one of the things I really try to focus on. It's like, don't freak out because you don't have that warm, gushy feeling. It's okay. It's a lot, just as you described, it's about paying attention differently.
Yeah. So is that what you primarily mean by expansion, as we're talking about this
Hmm.
constriction, expansion? It's really stepping into love, right?
You could say that it's stepping into a different kind of awareness.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I know Ramdas uses that phrase, loving awareness, all the time because the word mindfulness, which really means the same thing, if you like a standard definition of mindfulness would be a quality of awareness that isn't clinging to what's arising, it's not condemning it or pushing it away, and it's not spacing out or being deluded. So that's not that easy, you know, like, especially for many of us with the kind of conditioning we have about self judgment, you know, to be aware of what's going on without hating it, without feeling ashamed of it, without freaking out about what our emotional life is or our thought pattern is or our body, you know, whatever it is. And so the antidote to that is to really build almost like that muscle of kindness, you know, as to incorporate that into our awareness. And that would be a genuine kind of mindfulness. But the word mindfulness sounds so cold, you know,
Hmm.
and doesn't necessarily take in the understanding that, yeah, you know, in order to not fall into that kind of harsh self judgment, you sort of need the other quality to
Yeah.
be present. And so I hear, you know, people these days suggest, let's call it kindfulness or let's call it heartfulness or Ramdas's phrase, loving awareness,
Yeah.
you know, but it really means the same thing.
Yeah. There's this phrase that I've heard a lot, maybe in like dating communities or relationship advice, and this notion of you can't love somebody else until you love yourself. What does that strike for you?
Um, I think is a balance, you know, like the reason I hesitate over the phrase is because I've also seen a lot of people make it like a project. And when do you love yourself enough, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then I think of, say, the caregivers and the activists that I've worked with who really do love other people and not themselves very often,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know, but it sputters out or they get overwhelmed or it's not a balanced enough state, you know. So somewhere in there needs to be that balance. And but I think, you know, those people are genuinely motivated by a lot of care and
Yeah.
compassion for others. But when it's too much, you know, and there isn't the balance, I don't see how it can sustain.
Yeah. Yeah, that was one of the things that I found to be actually more challenging in the meta practice, is when you offer it towards yourself, and that's something that's like, it's so easy to think about my grandma who is still around, and just like, it's just like this easy, immediate, like, oh my God, love
Hmm.
my grandma. But then when it comes to me, it's like, hmm. like, yeah, I can like repeat the things, but it's just such a different experience. And it's like, it'd be nice to have that a little bit more synergized, and
Yeah.
that challenge of remembering like we're also sentient beings. As Buddhists, we talk about liberating all sentient beings, and yet we're like, yeah, but I'll be the last one.
You're right. Right. I'll
Yeah.
turn out the lights when it's all done.
Yeah. So, when we're talking about this spatial quality of love, you kind of mentioned like it helps to like work up your kindness and really be mindful of that. But is there something more primordial about it? Is this something that we need to cultivate, or is there something about our being that is unconditionally that?
Well, I hesitate with that too because I don't think it matters which way you frame it because there's
Yeah.
always work to do.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, you could say you cultivate, and that's certainly the Burmese model. To use that language, like you are cultivating a state of loving kindness or compassion. Other models, more Tibetan would be like this is an inherent quality of your being, but how do you access it? How do you trust it?
Yeah.
And so that you could say you're working it from the other direction, and that's fine. For some people, that's a much better model,
Yeah.
you know, but there's always work to do. Like I think of my friend Krishna Das, and he does Hindu devotional chanting, and we were teaching together somewhere, and he used this image from Hinduism. He said, the grace of God is always coming down upon us like a gentle rain, but we forget to cup our hands.
Wow. Oh, that's good.
So you can use that model.
Yeah. Wow. So, when we talk about cultivation, and this really leads us into a formal conversation on metta itself, this is something I'm fairly familiar with. I think you were the one who taught me in a year-long class I took with Ethan Nickturn.
Yeah.
You did a guest thing and talked about the Brahma Viharas, and that whole 8-week, 6-week course. I mean, you were a big part of that. But for the people who have never really heard of this, who might be regular meditators, how does this differentiate between this kind of open awareness, mindfulness practice?
Yeah, well, stylistically, they're very different. They're very connected in that they support one another, but stylistically, they're different. There are lots of ways people do metta practice. The way I learned, and so the way I teach, really is relying on the silent repetition of certain phrases. So rather than resting your attention on the breath or looking at your body, looking at the various emotions for insight, um, you repeat these phrases, which are a way of paying attention differently. So I call it a stretch. You know, um, it's like, what's it like? Maybe I'm in the habit of evaluating myself at the end of the day, and pretty much all I remember is the mistakes I made and the problems I had, and how I didn't say that word right, and how I embarrassed myself. And all that may be true, but that's not the only thing.
Yeah.
And so we stretch a little bit. Like if we're doing gratitude practice, we might stretch and say, anything else happened today? Anything good? In doing loving kindness, we stretch by wishing ourselves well. It's like offering a blessing or a gift. May I be happy, may I be safe, whatever phrases are in that way. And you see what happens. And then there's a part in the metta practice where we offer loving kindness to what is called a neutral person, someone we don't especially like or dislike. And people will often choose someone who's playing some role in their life. So they see them now and then, like checkout person in the supermarket or somebody you don't really have like a big feeling about. And they're the kind of person who ordinarily, not even through prejudice or bias, but just indifference, we tend to look right through. We don't relate in exactly the way you described. We're not really present.
Mhm.
And we may not even know their name, but just getting a sense of them in your practice and offering them the phrases, may you be safe, may you be happy. We are, in effect, looking at them rather than through them. And maybe the next time we go to the grocery store, they're there and it's actually different.
Wow.
So we use the phrases not to force a feeling or fabricate anything, but to stretch, and the way we're paying attention to ourselves and to others, and everything that happens from the practice comes from that.
Hmm. Yeah, you kind of hit on a point that I wanted to bring up in terms of not fabricating a feeling. I've done meta practice on and off for a bit, and there's been sessions that have felt qualitatively like, okay, there's like movement, there is warmth, there's something. But then there's been like large stretches where I'm just like, all right, gonna say these things, nothing is happening. Is there kind of a desired goal in that, or is it okay to just say the thing and it's like the intention itself is the practice?
The intention itself is the practice, and it's hard to believe, so it takes some time usually, and some guidance to appreciate that, because I think probably it's true for every meditation practice, but it's very, very true for metta practice that you will see the fruit or the benefit of it not in your sitting as much as in your life. Like when you go
That's
back into that grocery store and you see that person, and suddenly it's like, oh, here we are. It's two human beings instead of this object,
yeah, yeah,
That's the change. Or when I mean, my one of my signature stories about loving kindness practice happened when the first month that we moved into the Insight Meditation Society, we had no programming. And so those of us who were there said, well, let's just sit ourselves, we'll sit our own retreat. And I had always wanted to do metta practice. I had figured out, studied by then how to do it, but I didn't have a teacher to guide me. But I thought, okay, I'll do it on my own for a month. So I spent the first week doing loving kindness for myself all day long. And I felt absolutely nothing. It was like this completely dreary week. And then at the end of the week, something happened to someone we knew in Boston, in our larger community, and several of us had to suddenly leave the retreat. So I was one of the people. I was getting ready to leave in one of the bathrooms, and I dropped this big jar of something, which just like went down on the ground, and it shattered, and the stuff went everywhere. And I remember the first thought that came up in my mind was, "You are really a klutz, but I love you." And
oh
I thought,
wow,
look at that. You
yeah,
could have given me anything in the course of that week, and I could not have said anything was happening, and something was happening. And I've
wow,
seen that in myself. I've seen that in thousands of students at this point. And it's frustrating because we don't think I'm going to look at how I speak to myself the next time I make a mistake, or
yeah,
how I am meeting a stranger. We think, what happened in that half hour, and it's the
yeah.
same as it was before.
That's beautiful. It kind of, it feels like a fail-safe in the practice, kind of what I was talking about with the exertion and then like grasping. I feel like if it was something that got you like totally blasted open and like high, I feel like it'd be really easy to get kind of caught in the practice and
Hmm.
not bring it into your life and kind of use it as like a secret garden, as
Hmm.
my teacher
Hmm.
David would say. So it's kind of brilliant in that it works that way. Sometimes I'm glad things don't feel
Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
Little bit of patience there. Yeah. So, do you know? And I mean, this might be a little bit of a dovetail, but I know you're pretty plugged into the science of things. Is there any scientific um, studies on meta and kind of what that does?
Yeah. There are more and more. And, when the research sort of got more involved here in meditation, it was all mindfulness, and in
Hmm.
fact, there was a kind of struggle to define mindfulness, and some of the earliest studies were um, maybe more limited, because mindfulness was pretty well defined as noticing, noticing you're angry, noticing you're thinking or whatever. But there's that component of relationship that was harder to gauge, and it wasn't there, so you might notice you're thinking with complete shame, and that wouldn't be mindfulness, because the way you are relating is not balanced. And so but over time, there's been a lot more interest in studying loving kindness and compassion, and there's some interesting studies like the work of Tanya Singer in Germany, who is one of the people who's differentiating empathy from compassion, which is an
Mm,
interesting
yeah.
point, saying there are actually two different centers in the brain. And empathy, in some ways, is a kind of building block to compassion. It's like that resonance with somebody's difficulty or pain or suffering. But with compassion is almost like moving toward that situation, that person, to see if you can be of help. But empathy isn't necessarily followed by compassion. Like you may genuinely
Mm,
have a moment of tuning in and having the empathy, and you might be frightened by that, or you might be so exhausted anyway.
yeah.
You think, I
Yeah.
can't move toward that, or you might have that strange savior thing, like you're moving toward, but to be in control, and so understanding that those are actually distinct has been very interesting.
That is amazing. There's something about compassion whenever I kind of get into these conversations. It feels so vulnerable. And I mean, you're really kind of setting aside your personal boundaries in, again, a very expansive way. And I could empathize with people who see that and are totally wigged out by that. It's a very maybe a compromising position if you're in the street and you see somebody, I don't know, maybe like mugging somebody, or you see something bad happen. To move toward it, to me, really speaks of an immense courage. These kinds of practices, like the softening of the mind and heart. I mean, it really is some of the strongest things we can do as human beings.
Hmm. Yeah, and I don't, here too, I don't know that it's a prescription for a specific action. Like if I saw someone being mugged, I don't know if I would move toward it,
Yeah.
you know. But in one's heart, it's not to reject it, and it's not to consider the person harmed as the other, in a very alienated sense and nothing to do with me. And,
Hmm.
because that's, I mean, we think that's strength and being invulnerable, but it's just being armored and alone, and think about, why is there a crisis or an epidemic of loneliness in
Yeah.
this world, it's a very interesting thing to ponder.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting right now with our level of technology, and this is something everyone around me is reeling from, is just looking at the world and seeing the amount of violence that's taking place right now. And now we have videos just in our faces of things that never before in human history would you have such easy access to. That's something that I've been asking people who've really cultivated these practices is how do you personally have like a boundary with giving your awareness to something, which I think is important to be aware of what's happening, and then like what's like the proper distance from things that are well beyond your control.
Well, sometimes I actually ask myself, is there something I can do?
Yeah.
And, if there's not, then um, I don't see that my uh, anguish, or worry is going to add much to the situation. I'd rather look for something I can do.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I also understand that I didn't used to understand it so much, but um, like I got interviewed once about doom scrolling, and I didn't know what the term meant. So I had to ask the journalist, like, what's doom scrolling? And he had said he was asking me because one of my colleagues had recommended me. So
Mm.
then he described it, and I said, oh, yeah, I do that, And of course, it's like, as you say, it might be really important to read that story once and to recognize what's going on. By the time you're reading the same story the 50th time,
Yeah.
you're
Yeah.
overwhelmed, you're traumatized, you're not in a state where you're thinking, what can I do? Uh,
Yeah.
it's too much. And it's apparently purposeful on the parts of, people
Hmm.
who create algorithms. And so he described it to me, and I said, oh, yeah, I do that, and this is what I try. I try to remind myself this is not serving anybody
Yeah.
past the point where I've developed some greater awareness.
Yeah.
Um, and then when the article came out, I actually was in it, which doesn't always happen. And I said to that colleague, she was not in it. And I said, why did you recommend me? Is it because, I do it and you don't? And she said, no, no, I was just too busy. We all do
Wow.
it because it's very
Yeah.
seductive.
Yeah.
But again, I go back to the work I've done with caregivers and activists and think about, where does resilience actually come from? As you said earlier, there are some hard truths in this world, and they're real. And you can only take in so much at once, or you can only take in so much before you also need to take in the joy, which is another problem that caring people often have.
Yeah.
It feels too selfish, it's too self-preoccupied to enjoy anything when there's so much suffering. But again, you just have to look at, where's the resilience going to come from?
Yeah. Yeah, it requires having kind of a full well. You have to make
Yeah,
sure that you have something to draw from. And it can be really, again, it kind of comes down to what we were talking about with like, it's hard to give yourself meta, and
yeah,
it's, especially when we start to know so much about, the capitalistic structure we exist in, it's so easy to go down the rabbit hole of like, everything I enjoy causes harm.
yeah,
Even
yeah,
just like going to buy a bottle of water and it's just like,
yeah,
that is an issue, and it's hard to exist in that kind of system and still have respect for yourself.
yeah.
I talk to a lot of Gen Z folks who have really grown up with the internet, who are even more savvy than, my generation is. And I really feel for them. I had a time before the internet, I like developed with a perspective of more immediacy. But, I think the folks coming up are just a lot more aware of interdependence in a very grounded way.
Hmm.
And I think that it's hard to not feel a sense of overwhelm when you see just how long this momentum of, I guess, harvesting has taken on the world. And it's just like, how do I honor this while still
Yeah,
living a normal life?
yeah, yeah, yeah. And many people don't, like they just suffer. And I just think it's a shame because they have so much to give.
Yeah,
And it gets really hampered
yeah,
by that.
yeah. Yeah, it's also interesting that there are people that profit off from that as well. You kind of mentioned like the algorithms are literally feeding you things to rile you up, but we're so reliant, seemingly reliant on these social media platforms, and I mean even Google. Everything is modulated now to hook you, which is usually outrage. So
Yeah,
it's like
yeah,
simultaneously participating in these systems while trying to maintain balance. It really comes down to the mindfulness
yeah,
that,
yeah.
we really started this conversation with. Yeah. Yeah. Well, we are getting a time, and this does feel like a pretty solid place to end it. But I do want to give you a little bit of a moment to just kind of plug anything you have going on. If you're teaching anything, you got some new books that are out. How can people stay in contact with you?
Well, I don't know exactly when this episode will come out in terms of things I'm teaching, but my website is sharonsalzberg.com, so I'm easy to find, and the schedule will be up there. As you said, real life, is in a way my most recent book because the paperback edition just came out. Um, and I have things coming up through my website, like a 10-day online course on equanimity. Like there are a lot of fun things and
Amazing.
that I do.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, all those links will be provided. So, but that went by really fast, huh?
It
Um,
did, and I don't know what
yeah.
that sound is outside. Something's going on.
Oh, I didn't even hear it.
Oh,
So
good.
perfect. All right. Well, Sharon, thank you so much for giving me some of your time. Truly was an honor and quite a treat. So,
It's quite a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
yeah, of course. We'll see you next time. All right, that was the episode. Thank you so much for listening all the way through until the end. I really do make this show for you in particular. If you want to study with Sharon, head on over to SharonSalzberg.com. That link will be down below. or just pick up one of her books or watch one of her many interviews that you can find all over the internet. She's got 50 years of them, and they're all really good, so I really recommend it. With that, though, I hope you have a great couple of weeks, and we will see you again for another episode when that drops. Thank you so much. All right.